Hi, it's Dr. Jensen, and I thought I would share with you some of my research materials and protocol for a study that I did last semester. This might help you with ideas and clarify a few things when you work on your design a study assignment. So what you're looking at here is my IRB. So at every major university in the United States, we have what are called IRBs, which are institutional review boards or institutional research boards. And it's essentially a panel of professionals and faculty that review your study and purpose and methods and all the kinds of details that you're going to do. When they review this, they are looking for things that open up the university or yourself to liability, or they're also looking for any evidence of harm to your research subjects if you are studying people. So when you diagram your study and put all these pieces together, it's important to document everything and have kind of an external committee review to make sure you haven't left anything off and you've considered every possible risk and benefit on the research and covered all your bases. So this is the IRB. And you can tell the summary is it collects feedback from first responders, law enforcement, firefighters, EMTs, and administrators in a semi-structured interview format to better understand lessons learned from responding to terrorist attacks. So I have minimal risk to my subjects. It is a behavioral or social research project, and I can still work on it up until March. So this is the summary of what I was doing, but I'll come back to this in just a moment. First, let me share with you my certificate of completion. So if you're going to be a primary investigator or a researcher on a study, you have to complete the National Institute of Health Office of Extramural Research certification program to ask you questions about how best to protect human research participants to make sure you're not opening them up to harm or risk. It also tests you on things like keeping confidentiality and those sorts of things to make sure you're not doing anything wrong. So that was my renewal of that certificate. So this kind of safeguards those people that participate in my study. Over here, this is my official protocol where I kind of divest all the different things I'm working on. So here's the background. I felt it was necessary to do some interviews with people in the UK to determine how things are different from investigation and prevention in the UK versus United States. So I described where the work is situated, that I was studying terrorist attacks and active shooters domestically and internationally. And these are some more relevant and recent studies that are on the same topic, where I talk about what has been shared and kind of where my research is going. Okay. State how your research is a logical step in studying the topic. And this is where I talked about law enforcement are really not logistically free to solicit best practice from peer agencies and bring back to inform their units due to the constraints of their work environment. As a researcher, I'm provided the means which allow me to collect and interview collect the data, analyze it, disseminate it, and we do have after-action reports, one of which you read in Module 1, but they don't always have the depth and context needed to fully understand the landscape within which these decisions are made. So this is kind of an extension of what you might find in a report. So then you talk about your purpose. I'm collecting interview feedback from first responders. Hypothesizing, I'll be presented with things like resource limitations, communication gaps, and agency coordination challenges. This is who my subject population is: sworn law enforcement officers on the front lines, as well as investigators and trainers. Also administrators, deputies, sergeants, chief security people, security ministers, commissioners, national coordinators, etc. I'm also going to be doing videography in this study, so actually capturing scenes, photographs, and videos of some of the targets that were attacked, especially recently in the United Kingdom. So I actually did travel to Manchester Arena and document that area where the suicide bombing occurred, as you may recall, in the 2017 Ariana Grande concert. So I actually did videography of the train station, the arena, and the surrounding areas. So my travel was mostly for the United Kingdom, in London and Manchester. Some of the attacks were low profile, and some not even really heard of because there were low numbers of casualties, but I wanted to go ahead and document them anyway. So this talks about the fact that I'm doing interviews scheduled in advance, largely determined via convenient sampling due to availability and personnel changes between attacks, and kind of where these subjects are coming from. I talk about how many people I expect to interview, 20 subjects. I actually ended up with 25, so I was very fortunate, and anticipating people that might drop out or be unavailable, and so forth. So research subjects, in my case, I was interviewing cops for the most part. They're acting in official capacity, and the risks and disclosures are somewhat limited. So they aren't really risking a whole lot. They're just acting as a law enforcement officer. And if they do happen to disclose work-related information, then I have a responsibility to keep that confidential. I'm not asking for any tactical or compromising things that risk them not being effective in responding. So I talk about how I'm going to do some participant observation, analyzing the setting, the people, and kind of determining their responses while I'm out in the field. I also have to discuss some historic attacks. It's possible it may bring forward unpleasant memories. To avoid it, I will make sure that I have a gatekeeper or supervisor helping me determine the most suitable people for interview, and making sure that they're showing no symptoms of PTSD or other disorders that are triggered during interview. And if they do experience any duress or emotional discomfort, I will provide a referral to the appropriate counseling services. So these are all the kinds of things that you have to keep track of and do in order to pull off a study. It's many, many weeks and months of work just to gather the information, to schedule, and to develop your protocols and instruments you're going to use. It talks about potential benefits that people may get, potential risks, if I have any conflicts of interest or relationships I need to be aware of that might compromise my study, and so forth. So that's essentially what a protocol looks like. So you can get some ideas on things you might need to be writing about in your assignment. We also have a semi-structured interview guide and a responder questionnaire. So this is an example of a survey that you might see as someone that would be participating in my study. So first it says, what kind of first responder are you? You know, circle one. If you're an EMT, what class are you? What's your career type? Are you paid? Are you on call? Are you a volunteer? Looking at if your team follows best practice, how you share best practices as a group when you debrief attacks and your response. Do you consider terrorism a problem? Do you feel safe knowing people are threatening your life? Do you know a lot about terrorism? Do you watch the news when newscasters talk about it? How do you feel about it? And some of these are open-ended questions versus yes-no type response questions. Then I have some opinion questions about laws and humanitarian needs and providing aid to people in countries just to get their opinion on things, and whether or not they think the United States is handling terrorism appropriately. So these were kind of some questions to get us going. I also had a semi-structured interview guide. So they'd have to indicate which attack or event they were involved with as a first responder. How did the event begin for you? How did it end for you? And you see these are open-ended questions with prompts for clarification if they give me information I don't understand or I want to hear a little bit more. Which actions were most useful? What were your successes? Actions that were not helpful or even detrimental to the resolution of the attack or your obstacles? Did your organization complete a debriefing or an after-action report on the incident? How was it shared? And then some other categories we can look at that I can prompt them with questions like funding needs, grants, training and education, staffing issues, and so forth. So this was kind of a very loose, semi-structured interview guide. So my study was kind of three-part. First, a survey given to everyone participating in the study. Second, a semi-structured interview, discussion of how their involvement in the incident occurred. And then third, videography of the target site itself, what it looked like and now, and kind of how the cleanup occurred. So again, this just kind of shows you how these kinds of things come together. So I also had to send a letter out to my participants in advance so they kind of knew what I was doing. So this is what we would call an informed consent letter. So it describes who I am and my study and tells them you're invited to be part of a research study. This is the purpose of the study and the procedure, that it's going to be mostly interview, what the expected time commitment is, that you'll be asked questions in this kind of format. You have the option to refuse to be recorded, or you can be digitally recorded by the researcher in plain view, what the risks are. You can decline to answer any question you want, and you can terminate your involvement at any time if you choose. And then again, no direct benefits, but we may determine best practices to be used in the future. If you don't want to be involved in the study, you can choose not to participate. We ask that they don't disclose any identifying information on their questionnaire that they give back to us. Responses will be anonymous. I should preserve your confidentiality, including assigning you a code name. In research, we call this a pseudonym. Instead of your actual name like John Smith, we might call you Larry Eldworth or something. Interview transcriptions and notes will be kept locked in a cabinet, and then after they're transcribed, they'll be removed, erased, and destroyed. It talks about members of the researchers committee will review my data, make sure that everything was done properly, and any final publication of the names of public figures will be again reviewed, and kind of just again crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's. Everyone can get a transcript of their interview when they're done, and they just have to let me know if they'd like a transcript, and I'll provide that to them. And again, looking at confidentiality, how to use and destroy information once I'm finished, and so forth. And then this is my contact information and my study number of my approved institutional review board if you feel you have any issues. So this is what basically a consent letter looks like. Again, reinforcing that their participation is voluntary. There are unforeseeable risks. Every effort will be made to minimize those. There are no costs for you to participate in the study. There's no compensation for you to participate. That counseling referral is available, and you sign and date, and by doing so are giving consent that you've read and been told all this information. You have the opportunity to ask questions, that you can withdraw, and that you voluntarily agree to take part in the study. So again, these are all the preparations you would do as a researcher before you begin. Finally, one last thing to show you is my itinerary. So this was my trip. It was in October of 2018. This was my field interviews and videography. So I have my my flight numbers, and I had to submit all this to my department chair in advance. So I flew out of Jacksonville and then connected to New York, and then went from New York to London Heathrow Airport. Especially with the time differences, a lot of times you're just in transit, going from hotel to airline to cabs and trains and so forth. So usually your first day you're pretty tired. But then I started my interviews. So these are some of the interviews and places that I went. Some interviews I couldn't complete, others had to cancel, and that's kind of how it goes when you're out and about. Anything can happen, so you have to be prepared to go with the flow. These are other interviews that I had, and you have to kind of build in breaks and also time to retire to the hotel and do some interview transcription. Okay. The other part of the trip, again, the videography, was mostly on the London Tube or London Underground train. So these were some of the attack sites that I was able to document, and I'm hopefully going to be able to put this into the class so you can see some of what I captured. So these were the actual stations where different attacks occurred. I think I traveled to about 30 different stations, including the London Bridge Borough Market stabbings that occurred, and you notice these are all very current. within the last few years or the past 10 years, including the famous 2005 tube bombings. I actually went to that site as well. So rounding it out, eventually my trip came to a close, and I traveled to Manchester to conduct those interviews and go to Manchester Arena for videography. And then traveled back to London Heathrow and rested and headed back to Jacksonville, Florida. So this was a 10-day trip, and I was very, very tired at the end, but that's essentially what research can be. It's exciting, a lot of work, and a lot of details. So when you think about the population, you have to think about who they are and the kinds of things they're going through, and be able to adjust to those things. So you don't have to be nearly as detailed as I was in this assignment, but try to use these ideas to get as much detail as you can. And I hope this was helpful to you, and I want to share more with you as we continue in the class, so I look forward to that. Thanks again.